Ready? We're going to start with yellow.
Starmer's childcare revolution, promise or political theater. Right. Before we dive into what might be the most significant social policy shift in a generation, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to stay informed about what's actually happening behind the Westminster curtain, and I'll make sure you get the unvarnished truth every single time. Now then, let's talk about what happened this Monday, shall we? Sir Keir Starmer has just delivered what is calling a historic moment for working families across England. But is it really the game-changer he claims? Or are we witnessing yet another carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre designed to distract from the government's other mounting challenges? The facts are these. From this week, qualifying working parents in England now have access to 30 hours of free childcare per week for children over 9 months old. 30 hours. That's not a modest expansion. That's a complete restructuring of how we approach early years provision in this country. The Department for Education is claiming this will help over 500,000 children and save parents £7,500 annually per child. That's real money we're talking about, the kind that actually changes family budgets and life decisions. But here's where it gets interesting, and frankly, where Starmer's triumphant rhetoric starts to feel a bit hollow. The National Foundation for Educational Research has issued what can only be described as a rather pointed warning. They are saying, in the politest possible terms, that this entire scheme could collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Why? Because we simply don't have enough qualified nursery staff to make it work. Think about that for a moment. The government has essentially written a check that the childcare sector might not be able to cash. The NFER is being diplomatic, noting that workforce numbers are currently on track to meet government projections, but they've added a rather ominous caveat. This may not necessarily continue. In political speak, that's equivalent to flashing red warning lights. And here's the rub that really exposes a fundamental weakness in this entire enterprise. Early years workers are earning 36% less than comparable employees in other sectors. 36%. Despite recent wage increases, we're asking highly qualified professionals to care for our most vulnerable citizens whilst paying them wages that would make a retail assistant blush. The median hourly wage has crept up by a measly £2 compared to minimum wage levels. £2. For the people we're entrusting with our children's crucial developmental years. Paul Whiteman from the NAHT union has put it rather bluntly. The government needs to make a significant effort to raise both the profile and remuneration of early years employment. But significant effort requires significant investment, and that's precisely where this entire policy starts to look less like genuine reform and more like political posturing. Let's be absolutely clear about what's happening here. This isn't Starmer's brainchild. This expansion began under the Conservative government in April 2024, starting with 2-year-olds, then extending to 9-month-olds in September. What we're seeing now is simply the final phase of a Tory policy that Starmer has conveniently inherited and rebranded as his own plan for change. The timing is particularly telling, isn't it? Just as Labour faces mounting pressure over winter fuel payments, ongoing NHS crises, and economic uncertainty, suddenly we have this grand announcement about delivering promises. Starmer declared it a promise made and a promise delivered, which is rather rich considering he made precious few promises about childcare during the election campaign. Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson is spinning this as evidence that Labour can deliver against all odds. But what odds exactly? They inherited a policy framework, a funding mechanism, and an implementation timeline. The heavy lifting was done by their predecessors. What they've delivered is essentially showing up to collect someone else's homework. But let's not be entirely cynical here. The economic logic behind expanded childcare provision is sound. It does help retain talent in the workforce. It does provide children with crucial early development opportunities. And it does ease the financial burden on working families. The DFE's projections about living standards improvements aren't fantasy. They are based on real economic modeling. The question isn't whether this policy is beneficial. The question is whether it's sustainable. And that brings us back to those inconvenient warnings from the NFER. We're expanding provision without adequately addressing the fundamental structural problems that plague the sector. Low pay, high staff turnover, insufficient training opportunities, and chronic underinvestment in facilities. Here's what really concerns me about this entire rollout. The government has launched something called the Best Start in Life website alongside this expansion, promising guidance and support for parents on everything from pregnancy to school readiness. It's a nice touch, very modern, very digital first. But websites don't change nappies. Online guidance doesn't provide one-to-one attention to struggling toddlers. And fancy branding doesn't address the fact that many nurseries are already operating on razor-thin margins. The government is essentially asking the childcare sector to perform a minor miracle, dramatically expand capacity whilst maintaining quality, all on funding levels that barely cover current operations. It's rather like asking the NHS to treat more patients whilst cutting bed numbers. The mathematics simply don't add up. And this is where Starmer's approach reveals something quite telling about his governing style. He's excellent at claiming credit for positive developments, rather less forthcoming about addressing the underlying challenges that might undermine those developments. It's a very Tony Blair approach to politics, actually. All smooth presentation and convenient timing. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll find the same structural problems that have plagued British public services for decades. The truly maddening aspect of this entire situation is that with proper investment, this policy could genuinely transform early years provision in England. We know from international examples that high-quality, universal childcare provision delivers enormous social and economic benefits. Countries like Denmark and Sweden have demonstrated that when you properly fund early years services, when you pay staff professional wages, when you maintain appropriate staff-to-child ratios, the results are remarkable. But that requires political courage and long-term thinking. It requires acknowledging that quick fixes and photo opportunities aren't sufficient. It requires admitting that previous governments, including Labour governments, have systematically undervalued early years provision. And it requires genuine investment, not just in childcare places, but in the professionals who provide that care. Instead, what we're getting is classic British politics, a policy that sounds transformative, looks progressive, and will probably muddle through somehow, but doesn't actually address the fundamental problems it was supposedly designed to solve. The parents will get their 30 hours, the children will get some form of care, and the government will get their positive headlines. Meanwhile, nursery staff will continue leaving the sector in droves, quality will remain inconsistent, and we'll be back here in 12 months wondering why the system is creaking under pressure. The real test of this policy won't be Monday's launch day press releases. It'll be whether the system is still functioning effectively in 2 years' time, whether staff retention has improved, whether quality has been maintained, and whether parents can actually access the provision they've been promised. On those measures, frankly, the early indicators aren't particularly encouraging. So there you have it. Starmer's great childcare triumph is really a conservative policy delivered on schedule with Labour branding slapped on top. It's beneficial in principle, problematic in practice, and perfectly emblematic of modern British politics. All presentation, precious little substance, and absolutely no acknowledgement of the hard choices that genuine reform would require. The next time you hear Starmer talking about promises delivered, remember this moment. Remember that sometimes the most important promises are the ones politicians don't make, the investments they don't commit to, and the structural changes they don't pursue. Because those are usually the ones that actually matter. That's politics for you. Always complex, rarely straightforward, and absolutely never as simple as a headline suggests. If you want to stay ahead of the political narrative and understand what's really happening in Westminster, make sure you're subscribed because we'll be watching every move, dissecting every claim, and holding every promise to account. Hit that notification bell while you're at it, because British politics never sleeps, and neither do we.